A young girl named Olia was forced to marry a poor man, unaware of his true identity. But before we continue, please comment below with the city you're watching this video from. Enjoy. Olia sat on an old stool by the window of their small, dilapidated hut. Her tired gray eyes, veiled with a haze of sadness, watched the sparse snowflakes gently falling onto the frozen ground outside the foggy window. They floated in the air so light and free, and Olia couldn't help but envy them. They had no worries, no pain, and none of the grinding poverty that enveloped her life. She was only 19, but her face already bore the signs of weariness, fine wrinkles around her eyes, pale cheeks, and chapped lips that she often bit from anxiety. This was not the youth she had dreamed of, not filled with songs and dances, but a daily struggle for survival. Her childhood was marked by poverty. She remembered how her mother would mend her torn dresses, thin and almost transparent with age, patched at the knees and elbows. Olia wore them until the threads gave way. Then hid behind the stove, ashamed to face the neighboring children. Food was scarce, a thin soup made from potatoes or beets, sometimes with a pinch of salt, and a piece of bread if they were lucky. She ate it silently, staring into her bowl, dreaming of a piece of meat or even a spoonful of sour cream. But such days were rare, like sunshine in November. The neighboring women, stout and red-handed, would hiss as she passed, "Such poverty, no skin, no face. Who would want her?" Olia would shrink away, lower her head, and rush home, where only silence and cold awaited her. When she was 10, her life took a tragic turn. Her parents went to the market in a nearby village to sell a chicken and buy flour. The road was slippery, the car old, and fate was cruel. They never returned. Olia learned of this from their neighbor Marfa, who rushed over crying, "They've been in an accident, they're gone." She didn't cry then, just sat on the porch, staring into the void, until her grandmother Enya led her inside. From that day on, it was just the two of them. Grandma Enya was thin as an autumn leaf, with a stern gaze and a voice that cut like a knife. But her heart was kind. She loved Olia, even if she couldn't show it. To survive, Olia took a job as a milkmaid on a farm. She woke before dawn when the sky was still dark, pulled on leaky rubber boots, and trudged through the mud to the cowshed. Her hands smelled of milk and manure, her skin cracked from the cold, but she never complained. This was her life, and she knew no other. Grandma grew weaker each year. Her cough deepened, raspy like an old door hinge. Olia saw how hard it was for her to get up in the mornings. One evening, as Enya warmed her gnarled hands by the stove, she said, "Olia, it's time for you to marry. I can't manage alone anymore." Her voice was soft but firm. Olia froze, the spoon of cold soup trembling in her hand, a drop falling onto the table, leaving a gray stain. "Who, Grandma?" she asked almost in a whisper, fearing the answer. "Pisha, the newcomer. He moved here from another village, poor like us but hard-working. Together, it will be easier." Olia knew Pisha, a lanky fellow with crooked teeth and a bad reputation. He had appeared in the village the previous summer, living in an old hut on the outskirts, and rumors swirled around him, lazy, a drunkard, an outsider. No one had seen him work, but Grandma seemed to think otherwise. Olia's heart clenched with fear, as if gripped by a cold hand. She wanted to protest, to scream that she didn't want this, that she was still young, but looking into her grandmother's faded, worried eyes, her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. "All right, Grandma," she whispered, looking down. Inside, a familiar longing smoldered, a yearning for warmth, for freedom, for something more. But Olia had long learned to suppress it, like blowing out a candle to save wax. The wedding took place 2 weeks later. There were no flowers or music, only the crunch of snow underfoot, and the creaking of frozen boards in the old community hall where a few guests gathered. Olia stood in an old dress that Grandma had hastily altered with trembling hands. The fabric was thin, stained, and Olia felt naked in it despite the shawl and blouse. Her hair, usually loose, was braided into a tight plait that pulled at her temples, and her face was pale from cold and fear, almost as white as the snow outside. Pisha stood beside her, awkward in a faded shirt that hung loosely on him. His rough, red hands fidgeted with the hem, as if hiding something, shame or a secret. His eyes darted around, avoiding her gaze, and Olia thought he doesn't want this either. The wedding took place 2 weeks later. There were no flowers or music, only the crunch of snow underfoot, and the creaking of frozen boards in the old community hall where a few guests gathered. Olia stood in an old dress that Grandma had hastily altered with trembling hands. The fabric was thin, stained, and Olia felt naked in it despite the shawl and blouse. Her hair, usually loose, was braided into a tight plait that pulled at her temples, and her face was pale from cold and fear, almost as white as the snow outside. Pisha stood beside her, awkward in a faded shirt that hung loosely on him. His rough, red hands fidgeted with the hem, as if hiding something, shame or a secret. His eyes darted around, avoiding her gaze, and Olia thought he doesn't want this either. Old man Yeager officiated the ceremony, mumbling words about duty and family, his voice barely audible over the coughing and the wind's howl. The guests, a couple of neighbor women and a drunkard with an accordion that never played, drank cloudy moonshine from chipped glasses, and left, leaving behind the smell of alcohol and empty bottles. Olia and Pisha walked silently to his hut, as dilapidated as her own, with a crooked door and gaps in the walls that let in the cold wind. That night, lying on the hard bed under a thin blanket that offered no warmth, Olia cried quietly into her pillow. Tears streamed down her face, hot and salty, soaking the coarse fabric. "Why me?" she thought. But there were no answers, only silence and cold, her old companions. In the morning, Pisha rose early before dawn and left without a word. Olia lay staring at the ceiling until she heard the door creak open. He returned with an armful of firewood, dropped it by the stove, and sat on the floor, silently taking her old shoes, the ones with holes from last winter, and began to mend them. His fingers, rough and clumsy, struggled with the needle and thread, but he persisted, grunting with effort. Finally, he finished and handed them to her with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Wear these for now," he muttered, looking away. Olia took them, tracing the uneven stitches with her finger, and something warm stirred within her like the first shoot breaking through the snow. "We'll make do," she decided, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. But deep down a longing still whispered, what if there's more to life than this? Spring replaced winter, and the days passed slowly. Olia grew accustomed to Pitia's presence in their small life. He wasn't the lazy drunkard the village gossiped about. Quiet, yes, but not cruel. In his actions and rare words, there was no malice, only a weariness, as if he too carried a burden he never spoke of. He worked wherever he could, chopping wood for neighbors, returning with splinters in his hands, or hauling heavy sacks of grain at the farm where Olia milked the cows. She saw him stoop under their weight, wiping sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his worn shirt, and thought, he's like me, broken but alive. Olia continued her work as a milkmaid, rising each day before dawn. She pulled on rubber boots that clung to her feet from the dampness, and walked through the mud to the cowshed. There, in the dim light that smelled of hay and manure, she sat on a low stool, pressed her forehead against the warm flank of a cow, and milked until her hands ached. By evening, she returned home hunched and exhausted, collapsing onto the bench and staring at the ceiling. But amidst their gray and monotonous life, something new emerged, something that made her heart beat a little faster. One day in early May, when the air was soft and the grass by the river turned green, Pitia came home later than usual. Olia sat by the stove warming her hands over the weak fire. When the door creaked open and he entered, carrying a bunch of wildflowers, daisies with white petals and cornflowers as blue as a clear sky, she couldn't believe her eyes. "Thought these might brighten the place up," he said, shilly avoiding her gaze, and handed her the bouquet. His rough hands, scarred and calloused, gently held the stems as if afraid to crush them. Olia took the flowers, inhaled their delicate scent, and placed them in an old tin can on the windowsill. The hut, with its darkened walls and drafty gaps, seemed to come alive with a small piece of spring nestled in the corner. Olia looked at Pisha, at his crooked smile, and for the first time in a long while the corners of her mouth twitched in response. But the real miracle happened a few days later. Pisha was late again, and Olia began to worry watching the sun dip toward the horizon. She feared something had happened when the door burst open and he entered, cradling something small and trembling in his arms. It was a stray puppy, thin and dirty, with a wounded paw and a bloody scratch visible beneath its matted fur. "Found him by the river," Pitya murmured, kneeling by the stove. "Someone must have abandoned him, poor thing." He didn't wait for her response. He wet an old rag and began gently cleaning the puppy, washing away the dirt from its shivering body. His large, clumsy hands, accustomed to the axe and shovel, moved slowly and carefully, as if afraid to cause more pain. Olia watched as he tended to the wound on the puppy's paw, whispering soothing words, "Hang in there, little one. It'll feel better soon." Then he tore a strip from his old shirt, the one he wore every day, and carefully bandaged the paw, tying a small knot. The puppy nestled its nose into his palm, and Pitya took a piece of bread from his pocket, softened it with water, and offered it to the little mouth. "Eat up, silly," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Olia watched, unable to look away. She saw the kindness in his eyes, the gentleness in his touch, and something within her shifted. Every evening, Pisha returned to the puppy, whom he named Sharik, bringing leftover food, and sitting beside him until he finished eating. He changed the bandages, stroked his head, and told him silly stories as if the puppy could understand. One night, Olia found Pisha asleep on the floor by the stove, with Sharik curled up beside him. Something inside her stirred again. This lanky man with crooked teeth, whom everyone dismissed as worthless, was capable of such tender care and selfless kindness. He told funny, nonsensical stories about an old man who caught fish with his bare hands and boasted of catching a mermaid. About a chicken that ran away to the forest and returned with a brood of chicks, about a cloud that once sat on a roof and refused to leave. Olia listened, sitting on the bench, and laughed softly, genuinely. His voice warm and comforting, and his quiet laughter echoed in the dimly lit hut, becoming her refuge from the endless grayness of her life. Sharik, now stronger, followed Pitya everywhere, wagging his tail, and Olia found herself thinking that poverty, cold, and thin soup weren't so terrible with him by her side. Her heart, frozen from hardship, began to thaw, warmed by his kindness, and the simple joy of their shared laughter. Maybe this is happiness, she thought, looking at his crooked smile, the flowers in the can, and the puppy playing at their feet. Sharik, now stronger, followed Pitya everywhere, wagging his tail, and Olia found herself thinking that poverty, cold, and thin soup weren't so terrible with him by her side. Her heart, frozen from hardship, began to thaw, warmed by his kindness, and the simple joy of their shared laughter. Maybe this is happiness, she thought, looking at his crooked smile, the flowers in the can, and the puppy playing at their feet. She woke from the cold as if someone had pulled the blanket from under her. The bed beside her was empty. Pitya was gone. Olia ran her hand over the cold sheet, still holding the imprint of his body, and her heart pounded with anxiety like a trapped bird in a cage. The hut was silent except for the faint whisper of wind outside and the distant barking of dogs. She sat up, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and stared into the darkness, trying to calm her trembling. Where did he go? She wondered, her mind racing with frightening images. He fell into a ditch, he was taken for debts, or worse, he ran away, leaving her alone like her parents did in that cursed accident. She waited, pressed against the foggy window, watching the dark yard where tree shadows danced in the moonlight. Time crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, as the first faint rays of sunlight began to lighten the rooftops, she heard an unfamiliar sound, a deep, powerful engine rumble alien to their quiet village. The door burst open, and Pitya entered, but it wasn't the Pitya she knew. He stepped out of a shiny black car parked in the yard. Dressed in clean clothes, not his usual worn shirt, but a crisp white shirt and tailored pants that fit him perfectly. His face was clean shaven, his usually disheveled hair neatly combed. Olia froze, standing in the middle of the hut, her bare feet rooted to the cold floor. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. This was him, yet not him, familiar yet strange, like a ghost from a dream. Sharik, lying by the stove, lifted his head, barked once, and curled up again, as if nothing had changed. Pisha sat down on the bench, avoiding her gaze, and sighed heavily. He ran a hand over his face, as if gathering strength, and said quietly, "Olia, I need to tell you the truth. I'm not really poor." He had hidden it all this time to find true love, not greed. His voice trembled, breaking on the low notes, each word falling like a stone into an abyss, cutting her heart like a knife. Olia stood motionless, feeling hot, unwanted tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't speak. Her throat was constricted as if invisible hands were choking her. Everything she loved, his rough hands, their shared struggles, his silly stories, his quiet laughter that dispelled her sorrow, now seemed like a cruel lie, a game in which she was a pawn. She turned slowly, as if in a dream, and walked out of the hut without a word. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in her chest. The world she had built in her heart, that small, warm sanctuary, where they stood together against all hardships, crumbled in an instant, leaving only emptiness and pain. Olia wandered to the river, the same one where Pitya once picked flowers for her, daisies and cornflowers that stood in the tin can until they wilted. Her feet sank into the soft grass, but she felt neither the earth's warmth nor the buzzing of bees around the flowers. She fell to her knees by the riverbank and hugged herself, trying to hold onto something that was slipping away. Tears flowed like a river, mixing with the sweat from the heat, and she sobbed loudly, desperately. Like a child who had lost everything. "I loved you for this, for your hands, for our poverty," she whispered to the wind, but the wind carried her words away, drowning them in the water. His rough hands, their humble hut, their evenings by the stove, all of it had been her support, her small happiness. And now he turned out to be a rich man playing at poverty, someone who looked down on her from above, testing her worth. She buried her face in her hands, feeling the ground shake with her sobs. The mosquitoes biting her neck, but she didn't care. She didn't hear him approach. Pisha found her there by the river, his steps heavy and uncertain. He knelt beside her, reaching out to comfort her, but she recoiled as if from fire. "Don't touch me," she cried, her voice breaking with pain and anger. "I mean nothing to you, a rich man. You have a million like me. You've been deceiving me all this time." Tears choked her, she gasped for breath, looking into his familiar yet strange face. His eyes, dark and shining, were filled with guilt, but she couldn't bear to see it. "Go away," she breathed, the word tearing from her like a final blow. Pisha tried to speak, his mouth opening, but no words came out. He stood up, head bowed, shoulders slumped like an old man, and walked away, leaving her alone. His footsteps faded in the distance, and Olia remained by the river, sitting there until the sun set and darkness enveloped her like a heavy blanket. She sat there all night, staring at the water glistening under the stars. Was it all a lie? Was it all just a game? She asked herself. But there were no answers, only the ringing in her ears and the emptiness in her heart. The longing that had smoldered within her since childhood returned, heavier and more merciless than ever. She thought of her parents, of how they left her, of her grandmother growing weaker each day, and now of Pisha, who had betrayed her trust. She had lost everything: love, faith in people, even the tiny spark of hope he had ignited in her soul. Pisha did not give up. After that night by the river, when Olia pushed him away, he could have vanished forever, dissolving into his wealthy world. But he returned the very next day at dawn, when the mist still hung over the village and the grass sparkled with dew. He came to their hut, carrying a basket of food: potatoes, bread, a piece of lard wrapped in cloth, and set it by the door without waiting for a response. Then he took up his axe and spent the day chopping wood. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands trembling from exhaustion, but he did not stop. The next day, he repaired the roof, climbing the rickety ladder to patch the gaps where snow would blow in during the winter. He never boasted about his wealth, never mentioned money, never spoke of the car that had turned her life upside down. He simply sat beside her on the bench when he finished his work and said, looking at the floor, "Olya, I love you. Not the money, but you." His voice was hoarse and sincere, and each time his words fell into her soul like pebbles into a deep well, sending ripples through her heart. Olya listened but said nothing. She sat by the window watching him through the foggy glass, not knowing what to say. Trust was shattered like an old cup that had fallen from a shelf in her childhood. The pieces could be gathered, but it would never be whole again. She remembered his rough hands, his silly stories, the flowers by the river, and her heart ached with pain. What if it was all just a game? She thought, the bitterness burning like embers in a hearth. But his action, simple, familiar, and kind, reminded her of the Pitya she had fallen in love with. The one who mended her shoes and laughed at the runaway chicken. One evening he came again, stooped and calloused, and left a letter by the door. It was written in childish, uneven handwriting on a scrap of paper torn from a notebook. Olya read the words standing by the window. Tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink, and she pressed the letter to her chest, feeling it tremble in her hands. For the first time in days, she wondered, what if he's sincere in his eyes when he looked at her? There was no pride or deceit, only longing and hope, like Sharik waiting for a scrap of bread. But the bitterness still held her in its grip, and she didn't know how to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. Another day passed, and Pitya returned. He stood at the door, looking at her with weary eyes, and said, "Olya, come with me to the city. We'll have a big, warm house. I'll buy you beautiful dresses, whatever you want." His voice was soft and pleading, but Olya shook her head slowly but firmly. "I don't want your wealthy life, Pitya. I want our village, our river, our hut," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. He looked at her for a long time, as if time itself had stopped, then nodded, lowering his head. "I understand," he said quietly, and left, leaving behind only the creak of the door and the emptiness in the yard. Olya remained alone, watching him go, tears streaming down her cheeks. She thought she had lost him forever, that he would return to the city, to his world of cars and money, and her heart, still loving him, would break from the loss. She cried, sitting on the bench, hugging Sharik, who nuzzled her hand, but it brought her no comfort. A week passed, long and heavy like a winter night. Olya went through the motions of her farm work, milking the cows, trudging through the mud, but her heart was not in it. She felt as if her soul had remained by that river. Grandma's cough worsened, and Olya feared losing her too. She didn't expect Pitya to return. She thought he was already in the city, in his wealthy world where she had no place. But one evening, as the sun set and the sky turned golden, she heard footsteps. The door creaked open, and Pitya entered without the car, without the clean shirt, wearing the same old, worn shirt he used to wear. His face was tired, his eyes red as if he hadn't slept for many nights. He stopped at the door and said quietly, "I sold the business, Olya." He gave away some of the money to the hospital and to orphanages. "I'll live here with you." Olya looked at him in disbelief. She stood up, took a step toward him, and her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. In his gaze, she saw the same kindness that had melted her heart before, the same crooked smile that made her laugh. Sharik, who had been lying by the stove, suddenly jumped up, barked with joy, and ran to Pitya, wagging his tail so hard he nearly knocked over the water bowl. He jumped around him, licking his hands, and Pitya laughed quietly, hoarsely, but genuinely. Tears welled up in Olya's eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. They started anew. Pitya no longer hid who he was, but he lived simply, as he had promised. He repaired huts, helped Grandma carry water, and built benches. They got cows and chickens, and their small yard came to life with the sounds of mooing, clucking, and Sharek's barking, all blending into a warm melody. Olia saw in him the same man with rough hands that petted Sharek, the same crooked smile that dispelled her sorrow. Her heart thawed, and she realized that she still loved him, and for who he had become for her sake. One evening they sat by the river, the same one where it all began and nearly ended. The sunset painted the water gold and pink, and the air was soft, filled with the scent of grass and flowers. Sharek chased butterflies by the water, his heeled paw strong and sure. Pisha picked a bouquet of wildflowers, daisies, and cornflowers, just like the first time, and placed them on Olia's lap. She took them, inhaled their sweet scent, and smiled genuinely without a trace of pain. He looked at her, his eyes shining in the sunset light, and said, "Thank you, Olia." She looked up, surprised. "For what, Pisha?" He took her hand, held it in his, and replied, "For not letting me go. For showing me that true happiness is here, with you, with Sharek by our river. I would have been lost in that city, in that wealth. You saved me." His voice trembled, and Olia saw a tear roll down his cheek, just one, but heavy with emotion. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "You saved me, Pitya." Grandma came out onto the porch, leaning on her cane, and smiled as she watched them. Sharek ran to her, nuzzling her hand, and she laughed softly, happily. The neighbors who used to gossip about them now came seeking advice and help, and their yard became the heart of the village. Poverty was left behind, but they found happiness not in wealth, but in each other, in the simple days, in the flowers by the river, in Sharek's barking, and in their shared laughter. Olia knew that her life was now as bright as the river at sunset, and no sorrow would ever find its way to her again.